Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. High foreheads and removed hair when beauty began at the line of the face. I remember well that afternoon of gentle breeze when the sun slowly spilled through the thick glass windows of the tower, casting golden patterns on the floor, light that seemed to be dreaming. I was seated before the polished copper mirror, its slight warping returning my reflection as if it were a memory rather than a present face. Beside me, on a cushion embroidered with linen thread, lay the instruments of the ritual, a small bone-handled razor, a dark wooden comb, and the little pot of hardened wax we used to smooth the hair. My maid, Iselotta, prepared everything with the care of someone handling not just aesthetics, but a belief. It was a time when beauty was measured in silence. The softness of one's expression was said to mirror the soul, and for that, the forehead had to rise like the stained glass of a cathedral, uninterrupted by stray hairs. It wasn't vanity, at least not the rushed kind we see today. It was almost devotion. We believed the ideal face resembled that of a contemplative saint, serene gaze, clear brow, and a countenance emptied of all earthly unrest. The razor slid ceremonially across the skin, its sound barely audible, a metallic murmur between sighs. Iselotta used to say it hurt more when there was hesitation in the hand, so I tried to keep my thoughts as clean as the space between my eyebrows, which grew narrower with each pass. As the days grew shorter and the cold crept through the window's cracks, we continued our rituals before the mirror as if it held a promise of order and beauty. There was something deeply soothing in the repetition of those gestures, the tweezers plucking one hair, then another, and another still, until the hairline receded by a few millimeters, making room for a forehead that seemed to touch the sky. Some of us wore tight ribbons at night to smooth the brow and train the hair not to return. Others applied infusions of rue and mint, believing the herbs not only purified the spirit, but weakened the follicles. And in whispers, we shaped ourselves like living sculptures, not of stone, but of discipline. I recall one night in particular, when we were all gathered by the manor's hearth, Iselotta, my widowed aunt, two young women from the nearby convent who had come to spend the winter with us, and me. We spoke little. Only the crackling wood and the soft scrape of razors filled the room. Yet there was peace, a kind of silent communion. Each of us, in her own way, surrendered to the small, intimate sacrifice of erasing one trait to reveal another, as if removing the hair from our foreheads also brushed away the world's unrest. My aunt would say that by taming the face, we tamed the spirit. And I, still young, believed her, for between one strand and the next, it felt as if something within us quieted. In time, I learned to read entire stories in other women's foreheads. There were the broad brows of court matrons, refined to the point they seemed painted with a miniature's brush. The faces of novices, still marked by shadows of brows, uncertain between obedience and vanity. And those who, though untouched, appeared natural, as if God himself had shaped them that way. Beauty then was not what leapt to the eye, but what rested gently upon it. A serene face was a gift for the beholder, and thus becoming beautiful was also an act of generosity. Not all women, of course, followed the custom. Some ladies from distant villages kept their thick brows and let their hair fall freely to their foreheads, saying they'd rather look alive than saintly. I didn't blame them. Deep down, there was a sadness in the ideal we pursued, a beauty that asked for renunciation, silence, and a soft fading of the self. Even so, when I saw myself in the milky glass with cleansed skin and gentle eyes beneath the fine line of my brows, I felt I had drawn near something sacred. It wasn't only about appearance, it was a stillness difficult to find in the noisy world beyond the manor walls. Sometimes on foggy mornings, I walked through the garden wrapped in a fine wool shawl, feeling the dew resting on leaves like sleeping blessings. In those hours, when the world still slumbered under mist, I thought of the paintings in the chapel, faces of Madonnas and martyrs, all bearing those elevated foreheads, soft as veils. Perhaps that was what we truly longed for in the end, to appear eternal, unmoved by time like the saints who adorned the stained glass, not out of vanity, but from a yearning for purity, for an ideal that never died, even when fashions changed and kings fell. Once during Lent, the prior came to our home for a simple meal and praised us discreetly. He said there was wisdom in women who bore the peace of illuminated manuscripts on their faces. Iselotta, always practical, simply smiled and returned to shaving the tiny hairs that had dared to sprout under the waxing moon. But I kept those words. To carry visible peace on one's face, it was as if the world could look upon us and for a moment believe that there was order, harmony, a place where nothing hurt. Perhaps that was the true purpose of our pursuit. Not beauty that shouted, but beauty that silenced. There were, of course, days when the skin burned and the eyes watered, especially on colder mornings, when the metal touched the brow with the chill of a renewed vow. In those moments, Iselotta prepared compresses with lavender infusion and dried calendula petals, which we placed over the skin like a silent pardon. The scent was soft, comforting, and seemed to return the sweetness lost between plucks and scrapes. Beauty, after all, was not only the final result. It was in the care of the gesture, the tenderness between one pain and the next. There was a kind of enchantment in the act of care itself. Sometimes, when night arrived with its long shadows and the wind made the curtains dance like playful specters, I would lie down with a cool, clean brow, wrapped in linen bandages soaked in soothing balms. The room was hushed, broken only by the occasional crack of wood in the fire. And there, eyes closed, face surrendered to the gentle dark, I imagined that perhaps one day someone would look upon a portrait of me, a tapestry, a painted miniature, and see, in that wide, smooth forehead, not just the beauty we once sought, but the peace we secretly longed to carry. As the years passed, I came to understand that this ideal of beauty was also a form of conversation between generations. My aunts, my grandmother, even the old nurse who once lulled us with stories, had lived this same ritual in their own ways. There was something moving about that invisible thread that connected us. A silent pact passed from woman to woman, like a whispered prayer. Even those whose hands no longer held steady remembered how to thin the brow line or warm the blade in wax before using it. It was as if, in smoothing the brow, we also smoothed our memories, making them soft, elegant, and worthy of staying. And so came the time when I guided the comb and blade across another's forehead. My niece, seated before the mirror with curious, slightly nervous eyes. I saw in her my own reflection from years before, and I understood tenderly that this pursuit of beauty was, above all, an act of passing something on. Like teaching how to light a candle or embroider a flower, not because it was needed, but because it was lovely. And as I smoothed her skin with gentle fingers, she smiled. A small, sacred smile, like one who understands that there is beauty in surrender, in silence, and in the things we do with care, even if the world never notices. The following spring, when daffodils began to bloom at the edges of the garden and doves built their nests beneath the roof tiles, fashion began to shift. Rumors spread of new haircuts, of more defined eyebrows, of a livelier, more colorful kind of beauty. The younger girls stopped shaving and let fine fringe grow like feathers, and some even drew false lines above their eyes with diluted charcoal. Iselotta wrinkled her nose, saying it was all impatience from those who had not yet learned to appreciate silence. And perhaps it was. Yet even so I watched with sweetness, as if beauty were merely changing seasons, not truly leaving. One day I tucked my razor inside a box lined with embroidered linen scraps. With it, I placed an old mirror, already clouded by time, and a small piece of blue ribbon I once used to hold my hair back at night. It was not a gesture of farewell, but of gratitude, like one who finishes a song and allows the final chord to linger slowly. My forehead was no longer so smooth, and my eyes bore wrinkles like stitches around remembered things. But within me, there was still that peace, that gentle light we had learned to cultivate in front of the mirror, with steady hands and a heart willing to find beauty in the edges of the face and of life. Today, when I look into the mirror, not the copper one, but an old glass heirloom from my mother, I see features delicately embroidered by time. The brow, no longer drawn as it once was, still holds the memory of what was sought there: serenity, balance, a certain inner silence traced before any words. And when my granddaughters run through the house, hair loose and brows thick like arches, I smile. They are beautiful in their own way, so full of life, so full of the world, and still, sometimes they ask me what it was like back then. So I tell them about the ribbons, the balms, the smudged mirror, the whispering blade. I tell them of cold nights and warm winter days, of nearly wordless evenings, and the fire's warmth that accompanied our gestures. And they listen, eyes shining, as if hearing a forgotten enchantment. Perhaps one day they will forget the details, perhaps they will only keep the feeling. But if ever, amid the noise of the modern world, they long for silence, for care, for beauty that rests gently, they will know where to find it, among the memories we left upon our faces and in our hearts. Pale as the moon, the ideal of quiet beauty. When I close my eyes and hear the night wind whispering between the cloister tiles, I return to that room scented with mint and lavender, high in a tower forgotten by time. That is where my cousin Olivetta lived, a young woman as pale as moonlight on dew. They used to say her beauty resembled that of the saints in stained glass windows, serene, distant, immaculate. In those olden days, when the world still moved slowly, being pale was more than appearance. It was a promise of silence, of nobility, of a life kept safe from the harshness of the fields. Olivetta would spend her afternoons by the window, stitching with delicate hands and slender fingers, always in half-light, protected from the sun as if it were an ancient danger. The sheer curtains danced in the breeze, and she, with her face turned inward, would murmur psalms and quiet melodies passed down to us by our grandmother. At dusk, she applied a whitening powder to her face, made from fine flour, dried petals, and a pinch of bone ash, a recipe passed down among the women of the house like a sacred secret. At night, she slept beneath pale veils soaked in mint water, trusting that the gentle darkness of dawn would bring even more brightness to her skin. Once I asked her if she ever longed to run through the fields like we did as children, picking blackberries until our fingers turned purple. She smiled, a light, distant smile, and said she had chosen a different kind of beauty, one that leaves no marks, that preserves itself like a pressed flower between the pages of a psalter. "The world can be noisy, cousin," she whispered, "but there's a deep peace in being like the moon, watching from afar, never burning." Her words stayed with me through many winters, like the echo of a bell that lingers after silence returns. The maids, whispering when they thought no one could hear, said that Olivetta had fallen ill when she was young, and that her paleness was not a gift, but a trace. An old fever had stolen the flush from her cheeks and the vigor from her mornings, leaving only a fragile body and a porcelain face. Yet still, she was treated like a living relic, admired for her composure, her calm, for never raising her voice or showing even the slightest hurry. It was as though everyone around her had accepted that her presence was a kind of gentle enchantment, woven not from health but from lightness. On the quietest nights, I would see her seated before the oval mirror, the one with the oak frame carved by monks, brushing her face with an almost ethereal powder. The lamplight made the fine dust shimmer as it settled onto her skin like snow on old stone. Beside her, a small ceramic pot held mint leaves wrapped in gauze, which she placed under her eyes with rhythmic movements, as if performing a ritual learned in dreams. Everything she did was so delicate that at times I believed I was witnessing a silent liturgy, a sacred act that required no words. She once told me she had read in a book, a gift from a quiet abbot, that the stars favored women who slept beneath white veils. According to him, the midnight breeze passing through perfumed cloth had the power to brighten both skin and soul. Olivetta believed it with a quiet kind of faith, the kind that needs no proof, only repetition. Every gesture, every fold of fabric, every whispered prayer at the close of day was an offering to serenity. And watching her, I too grew still, as if her paleness had the gift of making the whole world lighter. There were those outside our home who mocked her, young women with sun-kissed cheeks used to hills and open skies, saying Olivetta looked more like a statue than a girl. But within our walls, she was like a reliquary, not to be touched, only admired in silence. My uncle, a stern man of few words, looked at her as one might gaze upon a lit candle at an altar, with reverence and also with the sadness of knowing any breath could snuff it out. Sometimes I think it was that very care that kept her with us for so long, even though her health always seemed to hang by a thread. In winter, when the chapel bells rang muffled by snow, Olivetta seemed to become part of the house itself, nearly indistinguishable from the pale tapestries and linens stretched by the hearth. She liked those days, she said, because the white light reflecting off the windows made her skin look purer still. On those frozen afternoons, I'd find her by the fire, reading slowly, feet wrapped in soft furs and her face veiled in gauze, as if the fire itself were merely an ornament beside her own glow. I recall one afternoon in particular, when the snow fell so gently, it seemed the sky hesitated to touch the earth. I brought her a small basket of dried apples and mint sprigs from the inner garden. Olivetta smiled in that whisper of a way and asked me to set them on the table beside her jars and brushes. With her long, fine fingers, she selected a few leaves and murmured, "Tonight, I will dream of pale gardens." I never truly knew what she meant, but ever since, whenever I catch the scent of mint, I see her face outlined in shadow. Sometimes, during our evening talks, she would speak of a world where women didn't have to hide their blush, where they could laugh aloud in fields and let the sun kiss their faces without shame. But then she would fall quiet again, as if such thoughts were a secret mischief, something too wild for her porcelain nature. It wasn't sadness I saw in her eyes, it was acceptance, a kind of peace, known only by those who've chosen a narrow path and learned to walk it with grace. And maybe that's why we all bowed a little when passing her, afraid of breaking something too rare and fragile for this world. On feast days, when the hall echoed with laughter, drums and lifted cups, Olivetta always remained in her high alcove, watching through the curtains. She said the most lasting beauty was the one untouched by noise. I, who loved to dance and twirl until my feet floated, often hesitated to go up to her, afraid my joy might disturb the stillness she lived within. But when I did, I was always greeted with a gentle gaze and a piece of fabric she'd been patiently embroidering by candlelight. It was her way of being with us, even from a distance. In spring, when the stone walls breathed moisture and moss grew in the cracks, she would gather snowflower petals at dawn before the sun reached between the towers. She'd crush them with barley flour and drops of perfumed vinegar, crafting a cream she kept in blue glass jars. For days of too much light, she'd say, applying it to her temples in soft, circular strokes. It was as if her beauty depended on shielding herself from the world, on remaining in a dream state, and through that she made us believe that perhaps the dream was more real than the waking day. The years passed like leaves carried by a slow wind, and Olivetta seemed untouched by time. While everyone around her gathered lines on their faces and stories on their hands, she remained ethereal, a living portrait of serene youth. Some said her beauty was sorcery, that her powders and veils hid not just time's passing, but unseen sorrows. I never knew for sure, but I do remember that one night, as I tucked her among cushions, I saw a faint scar behind her ear, almost invisible. I didn't dare ask. There were things in her that called for silence, like bells heard only from a distance. That spring, when the willows bloomed too early, Olivetta grew ill in a quiet way, like a candle dimming before it has fully burned. There was no fever, no moaning, only an increasing stillness, as if she were leaving slowly without haste. Her final nights were bathed in bluish light from the open window, and she asked that her veils be changed with care, as though she still hoped to dream of pale gardens. Sitting by her side, holding her hand, cold as forgotten porcelain, I understood that her paleness was not just beauty, it was also a way of gently departing. After her passing, the tower became strangely quiet, even for a place so used to whispers. The curtains still moved with the breeze, and the jars of dried leaves remained where they had always been, as if waiting for her to return. The maids walked more slowly, and even the chapel bells seemed to toll more softly, out of respect. For weeks I avoided climbing to her chamber, afraid to find time pause there, like a relic holding a piece of eternity. But on a misty afternoon I gathered the courage and climbed the steps, one by one, as one ascends into a memory. When I opened the door, I was enveloped in a faint scent of mint and old wood. On the table rested her oval mirror, still dusted with white powder. Beside it, a linen-bound notebook I had never noticed before lay among bottles and threads. Its pages were filled with delicate notes, balm recipes, fragments of prayers, and reflections on beauty, silence, and time. On one of the final pages, in her steady hand, she had written, "To be pale is more than to be seen. It is to be remembered like a whisper the world can never erase." And then I understood. Her life had not been one of absence, but of a presence that chose to be light. Since then, I've kept some of those pages tucked into an old psalter that belonged to our grandmother. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I open it by the fire and let Olivetta's words speak again, not with thunder or grand gestures, but with the same calm rhythm as her fingers on linen. I've taught a few young women her infusion and ointment recipes, not as trends or vanities, but as small rituals of care and listening. And every time one of them veils her face in perfume before sleep, I feel a fragment of Olivetta's soul resting there too, like the echo of an ancient scent. Today, when I walk through the fields at dusk, I feel the sun on my face without guilt, and still I think of her, not as someone who hid from life, but as someone who chose a different kind of light, an inner light, soft and constant. Her ideal of beauty was not fleeting youth, but subtle presence, the kind that remains even after the eyes close. And when the full moon rises in the quiet sky, casting its pale light over the old rooftops, I think of Olivetta, and I smile. For I know that, from somewhere beyond time, she is still dreaming of white gardens and breezes that cleanse the skin and soul, with the serenity of one who, even unseen, is never truly gone. Long hair, loosened only in dreams. I was but a young novice when I arrived at the Abbey of Saint-Renald, in a time when the bells still echoed like prayers in the wind, and dawn always came wrapped in fog and silence. I remember well the feeling of cold stone beneath my bare feet, the whispers between the tapestries, and the scent of herbs hanging in the cloister. But there was something more. Something not easily named, a constant murmur from older times, hidden in the folds of veils and in the creases of time itself. And it was there, among hymns and stitching, that I began to understand the secrets women carried in their hair. Of all the teachings passed down by Abbess Almadine, None was spoken with such gentleness as the one concerning women's tresses. "Loose hair," she said softly, "is like a river out of its bed." Never a reprimand, merely an ancestral warning, wrapped in tenderness and tradition. The elder sisters wore linen caps with delicately bleached edges, from beneath which not a single strand escaped. We, the younger ones, spent hours braiding each other's hair, amid muffled giggles and patient fingers, always by the firelight and under gentle watch. It was a quiet ritual, not of shame, but of reverence. Hair was strength and blessing, but also a dream, and dreams in that world were something to be protected. Sometimes at night, after the readings and prayers, when the tower chimed its final bells and the hearth's warmth faded into glowing embers, I would hear an elder sister sigh as she secretly undid her braid. The sound was nearly imperceptible, the silk-like glide of thick strands across coarse habit cloth. And then, through the flickering candle shadows, I'd glimpse her hair falling like warm water over her shoulders. No one said a word. It was a moment of intimate delicacy, a whispered freedom that reminded us that beneath the veils and the rules, we were still made of flesh, of wind, and of memory. There were legends told in hushed tones, like prayers of another kind, of villages where women dreamt of their hair loose beneath the moonlight. They'd wake with a glow in their eyes, as if touched by something sacred. In the abbey, such tales weren't spoken of by day, but at night, when the world softened, some of us dared to remember. Once, Sister Clarice confided that she had dreamt of her hair chasing after her like a living cape, flowing behind as she wandered through open fields of lavender and golden wheat. And upon waking, she smiled like a child. Over time, I began to realize that every woman held a story in her hair, even when hidden beneath linen caps or veiled folds. Sister Almadine's grey strands had once been honey gold, they said, long enough to touch the ground before the convent gathered them with care. Sister Isabeau's hair was so dark it seemed to drink in the light, and there were whispers, perhaps exaggerated, that a blind pilgrim once mistook it for the wings of a raven. We never saw these tresses in daylight, yet they lived in stories that stitched our daily life with a touch of quiet magic. During the long winters, when snow piled against the windows and the wind howled like a weary spirit through wooden cracks, certain nights became more prone to dreaming. On those nights, wrapped in heavy blankets and lavender-scented air, I sometimes found myself running across an open field, my hair dancing behind me like a soft banner. I felt the sun on my face, the damp grass underfoot, and the freedom was so intense I woke with tears in my eyes, unsure if they were from joy or longing. Beside me, others stirred too, and a single glance told me we had dreamt the same dream. Once, a novice named Brigitte awoke in the middle of the night and, without realizing it, began to sing an old song about hair like rivers and women who dance beneath the moon. Her voice was so gentle, so serene, that none of us dared interrupt. When she finally fell silent, she opened her eyes slowly and smiled, as though returning from someplace far away. The abbess did not scold her. She simply offered a lit candle and guided her back to bed with tender hands. From that night on, we'd say those who dreamed of loose hair would wake up lighter, as if they had wandered through a world made only of breezes and memory. There was also a quiet belief among the elder sisters that hair could keep secrets. When a sister left, whether to another convent to eternal rest or to destinations unspoken, her braids were carefully coiled and buried in the mint garden beneath a small stone marked with a cross. They said doing so helped the soul find peace, and no memory would ever be lost completely. I myself helped bury Sister Justine's braid, and I remember the scent of damp earth, the sweetness of the moment, and the strange certainty that her memory would now live among the roots and leaves. Over the years, I came to see the veils and coifs not as restrictions, but as gestures of respect, small prayers stitched in fabric. It wasn't about hiding, but protecting what was most precious. Hair, though hidden, was ever present, in the delicate act of adjusting a cap, in the muffled sound of a brush at dusk, or in the ribbons each woman carefully chose on feast day eves. It was a silent language among women, an alphabet braided with affection and patience. And there was something deeply comforting in that routine. Even without revealing our hair, we felt its presence like an invisible mantle that united us. On cold mornings, when we gathered in the kitchen to prepare bread and broth, the rising steam warmed our cheeks and made our veils dance lightly, as if laughing in secret. And sometimes a single strand would slip loose, just one, and no one tucked it back right away. It was as if the house itself allowed such forgettings, as if the world understood that even the gentlest vows make room for tenderness. I remember one spring in particular, when the apple trees bloomed early and the sweet scent of petals filled the stone corridors. That season the abbess permitted us more time in the garden, and it was there, beneath the shade of a fig tree, that I saw Sister Isabeau, now elderly, let her hair down for the last time. It was not a dramatic gesture nor ceremonial. She simply removed her veil with slow hands and let the wind do the rest. Her grey strands floated like silver mist around her face, and her eyes, always so stern, softened like those of a girl in her first dance. That afternoon, no one spoke of what we'd seen, but that night as we lay in our beds, all of us dreamt of wind-blown hair. Gentle dreams where we ran across open fields or rested by streams, feet in the water and hair spread like wildflower crowns. It was as if Isabeau's silent gesture had set free some old memory that lived asleep within us. And when we woke, one by one, we exchanged knowing glances and smiled, a quiet smile, the kind shared when a secret needs no words. As the seasons turned, I came to understand that dreams of loose hair weren't just longings for freedom, but soft messages from the soul. Reminders that even in the most restrained routines, poetry remained. It wasn't rare for one of us, while sewing or gathering herbs, to hum an old tune without noticing. And it only took someone mentioning wind-blown strands for all of us to pause, as if feeling a breeze whisper across our scalps. It was something that kept us company, even when unnamed, like a quiet flame under the skin. On long autumn twilights, when days grew short and the cold winds carried echoes of ancient voices, I would run my hand over my veil with gratitude, not to hide, but to remember. For in that delicate cloth, I felt the light weight of the women who came before me, who had braided their stories into the same motions I now repeated. And even though my hair was never seen in the daylight, it lived on in dreams, loose, shining, dancing, as if made of longing and eternity. Then came the day I left the abbey. I was no longer a novice, no longer young. My reflection in the pewter mirror showed white strands where once there was chestnut, and my hands bore the soft marks of time and prayer. The sisters embraced me with tenderness, and before I left, the abbess gifted me a dark blue ribbon embroidered with tiny lilies, a simple adornment, but heavy with affection. As I descended the path to the village, I placed my veil upon a stone and walked with my hair loose for the first time beneath the sun, feeling it brush my shoulders like an ancient blessing. That night, I slept in a small wooden cottage, where the wind slipped gently through the cracks and the scent of wildflowers floated in through open windows. I dreamed I walked among the women I had known, all of them with their hair in the wind, smiling at one another in silence, as if recognizing a kindred soul. And when I awoke, with the sheets still warm and the morning whispering soft promises, I knew I was at peace. Because in the end, there is beauty in concealment and beauty in revelation. But it is in dreams, always in dreams, that our hair dances freely, like memories that never fade. Small lips, downcast eyes, the silent delicacy. I remember with tenderness a young woman named Aveline, who lived at the eastern edge of our village, just beside the fields where lavender bloomed without haste. Her home, covered in ivy and wrapped in wild rose bushes, was one of the quietest I've ever known, not for lack of life, but for its gentleness. When the wind blew in the late afternoon, the white linen curtains danced in the open windows like bridal veils, and the golden light of dusk slipped through the cracks with the same tenderness with which Aveline moved through the world. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words seemed to float, light as dried petals pressed between the pages of an old missal. They said her beauty came from silence, not from ornaments or bold colors, but from something more subtle, almost ethereal. Her lips, as fine as ink strokes on paper, barely curved into a smile, and her eyes remained lowered, as if always gazing at the ground or at some thought known only to her. The women in the village said she had been well taught, that she understood the value of modesty and restraint, but I liked to think there was a natural enchantment in her, like the hidden forest springs that whisper more than they sing. Aveline seemed to belong to another time, or perhaps to another way of being, where words were not needed to touch someone's heart. Once, as I passed by with my basket of kindling for the convent's hearth, I saw Aveline sitting by the well, her bare feet touching the cold morning earth. She was embroidering something onto a light blue handkerchief, but her eyes weren't on the cloth. They were turned inward, as if listening to music only she could hear. Brother Theobald, who tended the garden, paused beside me and said softly, "She smiles with her eyes closed, like the saints in stained glass." I merely nodded. There was in that girl a serenity that even time dared not hasten. Girls her age were, naturally, more talkative. They laughed in the fields during harvest, exchanged ribbons, sometimes even dared quick glances at the blacksmiths' and coopers' sons. Aveline, however, remained apart, always present, never at the center. Some said it came from strict upbringing, that her mother, widowed many years, followed the old ways with monastic discipline. Others said it was a gift. I, watching from afar with the curiosity of one who had seen many winters, suspected that she understood something the others had not yet learned, that not every presence needs to be loud, and that there is a kind of beauty that grows in silence, like moss on stones beneath the forest shade. The truth is, behind that silence, there was a whole world that few ever saw. Once I was asked to bring candles to the altar of the small chapel of St. Berthold, where Aveline tended to linens and floral arrangements. I entered slowly, as if intruding on a secret, and found her kneeling, carefully arranging a bouquet of herbs and dried flowers. She didn't notice me at first. Her movements were so gentle, they seemed to breathe in harmony with the chapel itself. When she finally looked up, she didn't meet my gaze directly, but gave a slight tilt of the head, so respectful, so moving. There was humility in every thread of her posture. The monks at the convent, men used to the weight of words and the penance of noise, admired her in silence. One of them, Brother Gaetan, once wrote in his observation journal, "The maiden's beauty is not of color nor laughter, but of absence. Where voice is lacking, grace overflows." And it was true. Aveline seemed sculpted not from stone, but from breeze and prayer. Her face, serene and pale, resembled the stained glass martyrs who smile with closed lips, as if holding a heavenly confidence. Even the most skeptical felt reverence in her presence, as if she carried with her a fragment of the cloister's peace. There were those, of course, who didn't understand her delicacy. The daughters of Lady Emmeline, lively and well-groomed, would whisper with restrained laughter that Aveline was too good even for words. Such remarks trickled through the village like rainwater. We heard them, but let them pass. Time, that old judge who observes without haste, took care of showing that some virtues do not shine at first, but, over time, take root in the hearts of those who know how to see. Aveline never responded to whispers, never changed her ways. She kept her soft voice, her eyes lowered, her footsteps light, as if every gesture were made in the name of something sacred. I remember one especially harsh winter, when many stayed indoors and the village halls grew quieter than usual. Aveline, despite the cutting wind, went daily to the home of old Magdala, a blind midwife who lived at the forest's edge. She brought her warm broths, clean cloths, and candles. She never said much, and even when Magdala asked for stories, she preferred to sing old hymns, so softly they sounded like prayers whispered to the firewood. "She does not waste words," the elder would say with a smile. "She plants them." And truly, with Aveline, even silence seemed fertile. Over time, I began to see that Aveline possessed a rare gift. She listened with her whole body. When someone spoke to her, she never interrupted or widened her eyes in surprise. She merely tilted her head slightly, like one receiving a confession, with the care of someone cradling a wounded bird. That simple gesture was enough to make people open up, even those who never imagined themselves capable of speaking. Children especially loved being near her. They brought her pebbles, feathers, rusty buttons, small treasures entrusted only to those they knew were kind, and she received them all with the reverence one gives to relics. On feast days, when music filled the courtyard and couples danced under lanterns, Aveline sat at the edge, beneath the plum tree, hands resting in her lap. Some thought it strange, but I knew she danced on the inside. Her eyes, though downcast, shimmered in the firelight like someone swaying to a different melody, older and unseen. Once, a young man approached her shyly to invite her to the circle. She declined with such a delicate gesture that he smiled anyway, as if blessed simply by being noticed. That's what she did. She turned small moments into gentle memories. In the months that followed, the village began to speak more softly, as if Aveline's example had become contagious. Not everyone changed overnight, of course, but I noticed more pauses in conversation, more thoughtful glances before replying, more calm gestures among the women in the market and the men at the forge. Silence, once mistaken for absence, began to be understood as a full presence, a presence that listened, observed, and welcomed. It was as if the young woman, with her small lips and lowered gaze, taught without raising her voice. Some passers-by, seeing her from afar, even slowed their steps as if passing by a roadside sanctuary. One spring, I heard Aveline had begun teaching children to embroider. Not in formal lessons, but in gatherings beneath the convent fig tree, where the girls sat in a circle, each with her embroidery hoop. She showed the stitches without speaking, guiding their fingers with hers, as if passing on not just a technique, but a way of being, discreet, attentive, loving. Some mothers were puzzled, but she hardly speaks to them, they'd say, and yet the children returned home with calmer eyes and lighter hearts. It was as if, in that shared silence between threads and needles, they learned more than 1,000 words could teach. One day, at summer's end, I found Aveline sitting on the chapel steps, holding a small copper mirror in her hands. She gazed into it sweetly, not with vanity, but as if seeking something old in her reflection. When she saw me, she smiled with her eyes, as always, and touched her lips gently, as if sharing a secret only the breeze could understand. I sat beside her in silence. We stayed there for many minutes, listening to the bells in the distance and the soft rustle of dry leaves carried by the wind. When I rose to leave, she handed me a slightly wilted mallow flower, saying only, "For what is left unsaid," and I knew it was a gift filled with meaning. With the years, many faces left the village, carried away by time or distant roads. But Aveline remained, with the same serene gaze, the same lips that chose restraint over excess. The girls of old had grown older, and some began to imitate her without realizing it, sitting quietly by the well, lowering their eyes when greeting someone, embroidering with greater gentleness. Even those who once mocked her quietness now sighed as she passed, as if recognizing something they had lost, and which in Aveline had never stopped blooming. Thus, she became, without effort or noise, a gentle mirror of all that is discreet yet enduring. At the feast of St. Remigius that year, the elders asked Aveline to light the first candle at the altar, a symbolic gesture once reserved for the village's most eloquent matriarch. Everyone fell silent as she climbed the 3 steps, a pale linen veil over her hair, her hands steady around the tall candle, the wick lit easily, and its flame reflected on her face as if recognizing an old home. There was no speech, no song, only light, and the way she stood still, with lowered eyes and unmoving lips before the saint's image. Some wept. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the moment rest on their shoulders like a hand-washed linen shawl. After that, it was not uncommon to hear someone say, after witnessing a beautiful scene or kind gesture, it was as Aveline would have done, not out of fashion, but out of reverence. There was a kind of beauty in her that could not be explained, only felt. When I saw her for the last time, many years later, she was tending the garden behind the convent, now filled with white flowers and healing herbs. She was older, yes, but no less serene. We sat on a stone bench, and she, as always, listened more than she spoke. As I said goodbye, she left me with words I carry to this day. What is unsaid still remains. And in that moment I understood that her silence had never been absence, but eternity in seed. Today, when the wind blows through the old village alleys and the curtains dance in the windows at dusk, I still remember Aveline and the peace her presence brought. There is something sacred in those who know how to be light, who move without sound and turn listening into a gift. One does not need a loud voice to mark a life, nor grand gestures to leave a memory. Beauty, as the monks would say, dwells in the silence of the gaze, and perhaps also in the humility of knowing when to lower it. Among so many noisy stories, I keep this one like a quiet reliquary, the memory of a girl with small lips, downcast eyes, and a heart as vast as a field after rain. And so, as you rest your head on this calm night, perhaps you too will remember someone like Aveline, or wish to be her, if only for a moment, a breath of gentleness in a hurried world, a presence that listens more than it replies, and that blooms in silence. Good night, dear traveler. May your dreams be soft, your thoughts quiet, and may you find beauty too in the pauses, the small gestures, and in that which, even unspoken, remains. Pale hands, long fingers, the portrait of noble hands. I remember well that pale morning when the mist danced between the cypresses and the cold seemed to nap upon the stone threshold. The house still carried the scent of freshly baked bread, and my grandmother, seated by the window, let the filtered light rest gently upon her hands. They were pale hands, nearly translucent, that seemed to belong to another time. Long fingers lay still upon a linen-embroidered handkerchief, and even there, in the most intimate corner of her routine, she carried a kind of quiet grace, as though the simple act of resting her hands was part of an ancient ritual. She used to say that hands were like unspoken words. They revealed what the face concealed, and in the time when she was a young woman, much was said by the way one held a glass, or how fingers moved while embroidering. The women of the village did not work the land if they wished to preserve what they called visible lineage, a beauty born not only of blood, but of care. It was common to see young ladies wearing fine gloves indoors, even in summer, while they dipped their fingers in infusions of milk and rose petals, not out of vanity, but from a secret desire to remain untouched by the world. There was a girl named Odeline who lived at the end of a mossy, cobbled lane. She was the only daughter of an old scribe, and although she came from no noble lineage, she carried herself with a discreet air of royalty. I never saw her without lace gloves, white in winter, pale blue in spring, They said she washed them in lavender and almond milk, and that she slept with her hands wrapped in warm cloths, soaked in clear honey, passed down from a recipe her great-grandmother had brought from a distant monastery. There was something almost sacred in the way she cared for her hands, as if she feared time would mark them too soon. Once, during the feast of Saint Berthold, I saw her remove her gloves at the village fountain, dipping her fingers in the water to cool her brow. Everyone nearby seemed to pause, as if something rare and intimate had been revealed. Her fingers, long and slender like those of a sculpture, moved gently and unhurriedly, as though each gesture had been rehearsed by invisible angels. Someone whispered that she had never washed laundry or sliced bread with a thick knife, the kind of rumor passed with equal parts envy and admiration among the more practical girls in the village. But Odeline was not haughty. On the contrary, she carried a sweetness that shone in every wave, in every serene glance she gave to her neighbors. She helped decorate the altar with wildflowers at the convent on Sundays, and gladly taught the younger girls how to prepare a chamomile and oat paste for tired hands. "You must love what you touch," she once said, rolling up her sleeves to show how skin could be cared for tenderly. And those hands, though soft, were not useless. They knew how to comfort, how to listen. Yes, for there was a wisdom there not born of labor but of something older, perhaps inherited from a time when women spoke more with gestures than with words. At my aunt's home, where she was raised among ladies of refined habits, there was a curious tradition. Each morning before breakfast, we would soak cloths in warm milk and gently rub our hands with calendula petals. It wasn't merely for appearance, but a moment of stillness, a pause to remember that the body, even in its quietest parts, also longed for tenderness. I was a child and would giggle at the tickle of petals on my palms, but my aunt would always repeat, "The hands, my dear, show who we are when no one is looking." Later, as I grew and began to visit the markets more often, I noticed how much hands revealed beyond words. The fruit sellers had firm fingers, slightly stained with the juices of figs and berries. The washerwomen bore short nails and palms rough as walnut shells. And yet, even among them, there was an instinctive care. One would use warm olive oil at night, another kept a jar of scented wax for her knuckles. It was as though, amid the toil of daily life, there remained a secret space reserved for beauty. Not the beauty that shows itself, but the kind cultivated in silence. And I often wondered why it was the hands, not the eyes nor the smile, that caused such stir in the old salons. But it only took watching the dances to understand. When two people met in a waltz, it was the light touch of fingers that first said everything: intent, hesitation, desire, or restraint. It was in the hands that the first chapter of any romance was written, and sometimes also the last. There were ladies who knew precisely how to fold their fingers when resting them on their lap, and gentlemen who practiced for weeks the proper way to offer a hand for the invitation of a dance. Oh, how lovely it was to see so much meaning in so small a gesture. There was a particularly harsh winter when the convent opened its doors to the village women for evenings of prayer and storytelling. I was too young to understand it all, but I remember clearly the image of an elderly nun, Sister Honoria, whose hands, though wrinkled, were so white they seemed made of wax. Around the hearth, she would show us how to prepare salves from pine resin and heather honey, explaining that well-cared-for hands were not vanity, but devotion. "God notices the care in the details," she would say, rubbing her palms with the reverence of someone lighting an altar. One evening, she told us of women centuries ago who soaked their hands in milk and petals not out of pride, but to preserve a quiet beauty in times when everything screamed. "It was a form of resistance," she murmured, gazing into the fire, as if she saw an ancient face in the flames, and somehow I understood. For in those repeated gestures, warming, soaking, drying, perfuming, there was a rhythm that calmed the spirit. As if, in caring for their hands, those women were reminding themselves that grace still lived in the world, even amid sparse harvests and unanswered letters. Over time, I began to observe my own hands more closely. They changed, of course, became firmer, then softer, and now carry marks that only the years know how to write. But every now and then, I still repeat the gesture of soaking them in a warm bowl of milk and rose petals, just as I did in childhood. Not for vanity, though the softness it leaves on the skin is a gift, but because there's something deeply comforting in the repetition. It's like lighting a candle at dusk, or hearing the chime of a spoon at the bottom of a teacup. A brief ritual that anchors us in the present and connects us to what came before. Sometimes, when the days are long and the night takes its time to arrive, I imagine all those hands from the past, Odeline's, my grandmother's, Sister Honoria's, resting on embroidered cloths, holding herbs, composing prayers in silence. I imagine what they touched, what they comforted, what they let go, and I realize that hands in their quiet discretion hold more stories than many talkative faces. They do not lie nor exaggerate. They simply tell, with tenderness, what time forgot to erase. In the old fairs, it was common to see women offering not just fruit or fabric, but also small jars of homemade balms, calendula oils, rose vinegars, lily infusions. They would say that just a drop massaged onto the back of the hand before sleep would bring sweeter dreams. Some applied them while praying for distant children, others just before writing a letter. There was always a link between touch and care, between what was felt and what one wished to preserve. Hands, after all, were in everything, in affection, in farewells, in writing, in labor, and in forgiveness. Even men, though they rarely said so aloud, had their rituals. My father, for instance, kept a small jar of walnut butter hidden in the cupboard and used it at the end of each day after working with wood. I watched him silently. He applied the cream slowly, like someone closing a chapter. His fingers, though rough, treated the knots in his joints with surprising tenderness. Hands must last a lifetime, he once told me, almost in a whisper, as if sharing a secret only the elders knew. And I never forgot. During harvest season, the younger women would gather at dusk, once the baskets were full and shoulders tired. They sat on low stools beneath the fig trees, with basins of warm water and mint leaves floating within. It was a scene of quiet laughter and soft murmurs, where weary hands found new perfumes and remembered how to breathe. Those gatherings were more than care. They were confidences, comfort, and sometimes hope. There, among soaked fingers and whispered stories, bloomed an invisible sisterhood that outlasted the winters. I remember well the first time I made a cream from dried flowers and lamb fat. It was a disaster, the mixture too thick, the smell too strong with burned herbs. But my aunt just smiled, scooped a bit between her fingers and said, "It's nearly there. A patient hand makes everything better." And she was right. It was in the small repetitions, in the failed attempts and slow gestures, that I learned the value of gentle persistence, of insisting, not with force, but with tenderness, like someone shaping a secret with their fingers and offering it to the world, wrapped in silence. Today, when the wind blows colder and the shadows stretch long across the garden, I like to light a honey candle and bring close the ceramic bowl I inherited from my grandmother. Into it, I pour warm milk, a few dried rose petals, and a spoonful of clear honey. I slowly immerse my hands, close my eyes, and everything around me falls quiet. I no longer hear the ticking clock, nor the creaking floor, only the subtle sound of my breath and the distant echo of the women who came before me, repeating the same gesture in other nights, in other homes, in other centuries. In those moments, I realize that hands are not only meant for doing, they hold, remember, sustain, and celebrate. They carry the scent of small children, the weight of fruit baskets, the dust of unwritten letters. And when time passes, as it does, and words are no longer enough, it is the hands that give the final caress, the light squeeze, the wordless truth. I was here. I was yours. Perhaps that is why their form was so revered. Because even the quietest nobility knows how to recognize, in the curve of a finger, the whole soul of a story. Now that my own fingers bear fine lines like rivers traced by time, I feel I better understand those old lessons. I no longer worry so much about the whiteness of the skin or the softness of the joints, but about what each gesture reveals. When I offer a cup of tea, when I hold a faded letter, when I touch the garden soil or stroke the hair of someone I love, there is a silent wisdom that pulses beneath the skin. It doesn't come from books, nor rehearsed words, but from the patient, loving repetition of gestures inherited, refined, and carefully kept. And so I end this memory, not with a grand event, but with a gentle touch, like a glove slipping slowly over skin, or petals falling into warm milk at nightfall. Because in the end, that is what remains. What we did with our hands when no one was looking. And if there is beauty in that, then perhaps we lived well. Good night, dear listener. May sleep come gently to you like serene fingers resting after a long day. Until our next memory. The waste of patience, corsets, laces, and containment. That night, the wind whispered through the cracks in the cottage walls as if asking permission to come in. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath my steps, and in the distance, the steady sound of bells marked the 8th hour of retreat. Seated beside the low fire, knees covered by a coarse wool blanket, I let memory guide me down the paths of a time when beauty was measured in silence and patience. It was in the winter of my 13th year that Grandma Bernadette called me to the attic, between dried herbs and satin boxes, for what they called the initiation of the calm body. She spoke little, her words always wrapped in long pauses, as if waiting for time's approval before emerging. That day, she pulled from a wooden chest a roll of thick linen, hand-stitched with tiny cross-shaped points. It was the belt of patience, as she called it. So the body learns to listen to the world before imposing itself upon it, she said, as she wrapped the cloth around my waist, pulling it snug, not with haste, but with firmness. I remember holding my breath, not from pain, but from reverence, as if each knot in the cord was a silent lesson from generations I barely knew, yet already felt within my chest. In the weeks that followed, I learned to sit with my knees together, never resting my back against the chair. "The balance of grace," Grandma murmured, adjusting my chin with the tip of her fingers. There was something ritualistic in it all. The slow steps to tie the corset, the scent of sun-dried linen, the whispers of older women as they stitched by candlelight. I didn't understand everything, it's true, but deep down I sensed that the tightness around my waist was more than vanity. It was a secret conversation with time itself. As the days passed, I began to notice the other girls in the village, all with waists shaped like willow branches, walking as if always on the verge of floating. There was beauty in their restrained gestures, but also a gentle melancholy, like birds accustomed to golden cages. Some came early in the morning to our porch, asking Grandma to tighten the cords of their bodices or teach them how to embroider tiny flowers into the linings, where only intimate eyes might see. It was a collective secret, shared with discretion and composure, like a song heard only when the world has fallen asleep. There were days when the body resisted and the ribs protested with light pinches as we climbed the hill to Mass. On such mornings, Grandma would rub lavender oil into my back and say, "The beauty that doesn't ache is the kind already lost to time." It wasn't a complaint. It was nearly a proverb, whispered with tenderness, like someone comforting a flower that bloomed too early. Slowly, I learned to breathe more softly, to eat in measured gestures, to stifle laughter with fingers over the lips. Containment, then, was no longer punishment. It became a way of sculpting one's own silence. The summer festivals were the only time the cords were loosened. The girls wore dresses with soft ribbons and flowers in their hair, yet still held their posture, as if the discipline had been stitched into them. One of them, Mireille, said that dancing with a loose bodice was like walking hand in hand with the wind. And truly, there was something freeing in that brief loosening of knots. We laughed more on those days, ran barefoot through the barley fields, and for a moment, beauty ceased to be a tight frame and became something that followed us. Light, like a shadow on a gentle afternoon. I especially remember one afternoon, beneath the plum trees, when Mireille confided that sometimes she dreamt of living without sashes, without veils, and without mirrors. Would anyone find us beautiful, she whispered, if we were just ourselves? I didn't know how to answer. The world felt far too big for such freedom. But in that moment, with the sweet scent of ripe fruit and the shy rustling of the leaves, I wished with all my heart that somewhere there might be a place where a body could rest without needing to hide. Grandma, who seemed to hear even unspoken thoughts, once told me about her youth. She said she too had worn the belt of patience, but had set it aside the day she fell in love with a man who praised the steadiness of her step, not the narrowness of her waist. That's when I learned, she said, there are those who see beauty in restraint, and those who see beauty where it ends. She smiled as she hemmed the bottom of my dress with calm fingers. Her words stayed with me, like an invisible embroidery on the skin. And whenever the cords tightened too much, I remembered there is sweetness too in choosing to loosen them. The years passed with the slowness of seasons in forgotten villages, and corsets changed shape, but not purpose. The younger girls began wearing sashes with colored ribbons, and some even dared to stitch tiny messages into the reverse of the fabric, words embroidered just for themselves, far from the world's eyes. I taught many of them the art of sitting with grace, but I always said, true elegance is carried inside where no cord can reach. Some smiled, others frowned, but all seemed to understand, if not at once, then in time. Today, I keep that first belt in a wooden chest that creaks when opened, in the room where the furniture already knows my name. The linen is yellowed now, and Grandma's stitches have nearly faded, but when I touch it, I can still feel the memory of cold mornings and words whispered like blessings. I don't wear it anymore, of course. My bones now prefer the generous space of rest, but sometimes I unroll it slowly, just to remember that there was once a time when beauty was a contained gesture, and even pain carried a kind of patience. Some visitors ask why I never hunch, even at my age. I say it's habit from the old posture, but deep down, I know it's more than that. It's a body that learned with gentleness and firmness to inhabit its own space with reverence. The years have taught me that there is wisdom in standing upright before life, not from vanity, but out of respect for the path that brought us here. And even though my dresses are loose now, and my ribbons merely decorative, I carry with me every knot, every adjustment, as if they were tiny stories stitched into my skin. On cold nights like this one, I like to light the hearth, warm my hands with apple tea, and watch the shadows dancing on the walls. Each shadow a trace of the past, the figure of Grandma sewing, Mireille smiling among the trees, or myself as a girl, struggling to tie the cords alone for the first time. And then, with a serene heart, I close my eyes and give thanks for the containment that shaped me, the freedom I found slowly, and the patience, always her, that taught me beauty in its softest form is that which holds itself quietly, without rush and without pain. If someone asks whether I regret those tight days between fabric and expectation, I'll say no. For there was care there too, in the fingers that pulled the laces, in the words spoken before mirrors, even in the small aches that taught us to wait. I learned that the body, like time, bends or rises according to the care it receives. And though beauty changes its face with each generation, there is something eternal in the way a woman sits, dresses, offers herself to the world with quiet and presence. Some nights, I leave the window slightly open just to feel the soft wind touch my face, a wind that needs not shape anything, only pass through. I hear the distant bells and imagine today's girls with their own rituals, their own mirrors. May they find grace, I think, not in the tightening of sashes, but in the lightness of their gestures, and may they know the patience that shapes is also the one that frees. And so, with my heart warmed by gentle memories, I fall asleep in peace, like one resting within a seam-free dress, stitched only with memory, silence, and love.